The snow fell in sheets across the northern wilderness, each flake a tiny messenger from a sky that had turned the color of old iron. Evelyn Ashford pulled her worn coat tighter around her shoulders and pressed forward through the drifts, her boots breaking through the frozen crust with each labored step. The cold bit at her exposed skin with familiar teeth. She had known worse, much worse. 3 years since the border wars had ended. 3 years since she had walked away from the field hospitals where men and shifters alike had bled out beneath her hands. 3 years of trying to forget the screams, the prayers, the silence that followed when prayers went unanswered. Now she was simply the nurse of Millbrook, the only medical professional for 30 miles in any direction. A small life for a woman who had once held death at bay with nothing but her skill and stubborn refusal to let go. But small lives had their comforts: routine, purpose. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that when old Thomas Brennan wheezed through another winter, it was because of the herbs she had gathered and the tinctures she had brewed. Today's mission was simple. Feverfew grew in the neutral territory between the human settlement and shifter lands, hardy enough to survive beneath the snow if one knew where to look. Evelyn knew. She had mapped every useful plant within a day's walk of Millbrook, cataloging them with the same meticulous care she had once used to track supply routes and casualty reports. The forest closed around her as she moved deeper into the wilderness. Ancient pines stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with white. The silence here was different from the silence of her small cabin. Deeper, older, the kind of silence that reminded a person how small they truly were in the grand scheme of things. Her hand moved unconsciously to the pendant beneath her layers of clothing. Silver, worn smooth by generations of worried fingers, a crescent moon cradling a single star. The only thing she had left of her grandmother, the woman who had raised her after the fever, took her parents when she was 7 years old. "You carry healing in your hands, Evelyn." Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, as clear as if the old woman stood beside her in the snow. "Never forget that your gentleness is not weakness. It is your greatest strength." Easy words to believe when she was a child, sitting by the fire while her grandmother braided her pale hair. Harder to hold on to when she was 23, covered in blood that was not her own, watching a young soldier's eyes go dim because she could not work fast enough, could not stop the bleeding, could not perform miracles no matter how desperately she tried. Evelyn shook off the memory. The past was a country she had chosen to leave. Looking back served no purpose. The cry came without warning. It cut through the winter stillness like a blade, high and thin and desperate. Evelyn froze mid-step, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. She knew that sound. She had heard it too many times on too many battlefields, the cry of a child in distress. But there were no children out here, no settlements, nothing but wilderness and wolves, and the cry came again, weaker this time, and Evelyn's feet were moving before her mind had finished processing. West. The sound had come from the west, deeper into the forest, closer to territory she had no business entering. Shifter territory, wolf territory. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed at her to turn back. The border between human and shifter lands existed for a reason. Humans who crossed it uninvited rarely returned to tell the tale. The peace that had ended the border wars was fragile, maintained more by mutual exhaustion than genuine trust. But that cry. Evelyn had spent 3 years trying to build a quiet life, 3 years trying to convince herself that she could walk away from suffering, that it was not her responsibility to save everyone, that she had given enough of herself to a world that would never stop demanding more. The cry came a third time, barely audible now. She ran. The trees thinned as she pushed deeper into the forest, her lungs burning with cold air, her legs aching from the effort of moving through deep snow. The rational part of her mind cataloged her situation with clinical detachment. She was alone, unarmed, entering hostile territory for reasons that defied all logic. If she died out here, no one would know what had happened to her. Millbrook would simply have to find another nurse. None of it mattered. She could not walk away. The clearing opened before her like a wound in the forest, a small circle of trampled snow surrounded by ancient oaks. And there, huddled against the gnarled roots of the largest tree, lay a wolf pup unlike any she had ever seen. Its fur was silver-white, so pale it almost disappeared against the snow, interrupted only by delicate patterns of darker gray around its muzzle and ears. It was small, far too small for the season. its body trembling with a violence that spoke of advanced hypothermia and exhaustion. But what struck Evelyn most forcefully were its eyes. Golden amber, bright with an intelligence that no ordinary animal possessed. A shifter child, a wolf clan infant, caught somewhere between forms, too weak to maintain either shape fully. Evelyn approached slowly, her movements deliberate and unthreatening. She had treated shifter wounded during the war, though never by choice. They had been brought to her field hospital when the fighting grew desperate, when there were not enough shifter healers to tend to their own. She remembered their eyes most of all, the same ancient awareness that looked at her now from this tiny, shivering body. Her trained gaze swept over the pup with professional assessment. Based on its size and development, the infant appeared to be no more than 4 months old, perhaps younger given its severely malnourished state. Its hind legs lay at wrong angles, twisted in ways that spoke of congenital malformation rather than injury. A birth defect, severe enough to prevent normal movement. The pup had not walked to this clearing. Someone had left it here to die. "Hello, little one." Evelyn kept her voice soft, extending her hand palm up to allow the pup to catch her scent. "I am not going to hurt you." The pup's response was a low growl, weak but defiant. Its amber eyes tracked her movement with sharp focus, despite its obvious distress. Warning her away, protecting itself the only way it could. Evelyn's heart clenched. She had seen this before, in soldiers who knew they were dying but refused to give in, that desperate, furious will to survive. "I am a healer." She settled onto her knees in the snow, ignoring the cold that immediately began seeping through her trousers. "I help people who are hurt. Will you let me help you?" The growling faded to a whimper. The pup's head dropped to the snow, its strength visibly failing. Surrender of a kind. The surrender of a creature that had fought as long as it could and had nothing left to give. Moving with careful precision, Evelyn reached out and touched the pup's flank. Its fur was ice cold, its skin beneath showing the pallor of a body that had been exposed to the elements far too long. Hours at minimum, possibly a full day. That it was still alive at all spoke to an extraordinary constitution, or perhaps simply an extraordinary will. She ran her fingers along its malformed hind legs, feeling the bones beneath the skin. The joints had not formed correctly in the womb, leaving the limbs twisted and largely useless. A condition she had seen in human infants, treatable with time and proper care, but impossible to correct without intervention. Someone had looked at this child and seen only the disability. Someone had decided it was not worth saving. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She had witnessed countless horrors during the war. Men torn apart by claws, shifters with wounds that would have killed a human 3 times over, fighting on through sheer ferocity. But there was something uniquely monstrous about abandoning an infant to die of exposure because it had been born imperfect. She unwound the scarf from her neck and wrapped the pup carefully, lifting its fragile body against her chest. It whimpered once, then fell silent, burrowing instinctively toward her warmth. "I am going to take care of you." The promise left her lips before she could think better of it. No one deserves to die alone in the cold. The snap of a twig behind her was the only warning she received. Evelyn spun, clutching the pup protectively against her chest, her free hand reaching for nothing. She had no weapon, no defense, only her body between this child and whatever had found them. He stood at the edge of the clearing like something carved from shadow and stone. Nearly 7 feet of raw physical power, dressed in black furs that made his broad shoulders seem impossibly wide. Dark hair fell to his shoulders, half wild, streaked with gray at the temples, despite a face that could not have seen more than 35 winters. A scar ran from his right temple to his jaw, the mark of a blade that had come within inches of killing him. But it was his eyes that stopped Evelyn's breath in her throat. Golden amber, the exact shade of the pup she held. The alpha king of the northern wolves, Magnus Ironwood. She had never seen him in person, but she had heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories. The warrior who had united 3 warring clans through blood and fire. The general who had led the final assault on the Eastern Front, ending the border wars with a treaty signed in the ashes of 1,000 dead. The monster who was said to have torn out the throats of his enemies with his bare teeth. He stood motionless, but the threat radiating from him was palpable, pressing against her like a physical weight. Every instinct Evelyn possessed screamed at her to run, to drop the pup and flee, to save herself while she still could. She did not move. "Human." His voice was low, rough, carrying the rumble of a growl beneath the word. "You have entered wolf territory uninvited." Evelyn forced herself to meet his gaze. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her temples, but her voice emerged steady. A gift from years of working in chaos, of learning to project calm when everything around her was falling apart. "This child was suffering. I heard it crying." Something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps, or recognition. Gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "That is not your concern." He moved toward her, 3 long strides that ate up the distance between them with predatory grace. Up close, he was even more imposing, his presence like a force of nature, something primal and dangerous that existed beyond the boundaries of civilized understanding. Evelyn held her ground. He was going to kill her. She knew it with the same certainty she knew her own name. She had trespassed on his territory, touched what belonged to his people. The laws that governed shifter society did not make allowances for good intentions, but if she was going to die, she would do it standing. "The pup is weak." Magnus Ironwood's voice was cold, empty of inflection. "Nature has made its judgment. Nature also gave me hands that can heal." Evelyn tightened her grip on the bundle in her arms, and a heart that cannot turn away from suffering. She watched his nostrils flare as he scented the air, his amber eyes narrowing as he studied her with an intensity that felt like being dissected. He was cataloging her, she realized, noting the calluses on her hands, the practical cut of her hair, the worn quality of her clothing, reading her history in the small details the way a tracker read prints in snow. "You smell of herbs and medicine." His head tilted slightly. "You are a healer among your kind." "A nurse," Evelyn confirmed. "I was gathering feverfew when I heard crying." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind picked up, sending snow swirling between them, and Evelyn became acutely aware of how cold she was, how tired, how utterly alone in this wilderness with a creature who could end her existence with a single swipe of clawed hand. Magnus Ironwood's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped beneath the scar on his face. "That pup is my son." The words hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Her arms tightened reflexively around the small body in her embrace, and she saw Magnus track the movement, saw something shift in his expression that she could not identify. His son. Not just any shifter infant, but the heir to the northern wolf throne, the child who should have been protected above all others. Instead, he had been left in the snow to die. The council demanded it. Magnus spoke the words like they were broken glass in his mouth. "A future alpha cannot be imperfect." "And you allowed it?" Evelyn heard the horror in her own voice, felt the anger rising through her shock like heat through ice. "You let them abandon your son to die because he was born with damaged legs?" Something dangerous flashed in his amber eyes. "You know nothing of our ways, human. Nothing of the burden of leadership, the price of maintaining a pack's strength in a world that shows no mercy to weakness." "I know that this is a child." Evelyn surprised herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I know that he has been out here alone, starving, freezing, for who knows how long. And I know that you are the Alpha King. The word of Magnus Ironwood is law in these territories. If you say your son lives, who would dare challenge you?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Magnus stared at her with an expression she could not read, his massive frame motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. She had challenged him. A human woman, unarmed and alone, had questioned the Alpha King of the Northern Wolves in his own territory. She had just signed her death warrant. But instead of the violence she expected, Magnus Ironwood extended his arms. "Give me my son." Evelyn's grip tightened instinctively. She had no logical reason to refuse. The pup, the child, belonged to him. She had no claim, no rights, no authority here. And yet the thought of handing over this fragile life to the man who had allowed it to be discarded. "So you can leave him somewhere else to die?" The growl that emerged from Magnus's chest vibrated through the clearing, sending a spike of primal fear down Evelyn's spine. His eyes seemed to glow in the dim light, the wolf beneath his skin pressing against the surface. "You question me twice, human. Give me my son, or I will take him from your corpse." Every survival instinct screamed at her to comply. But Evelyn had learned long ago that survival instincts were not the same as moral ones. She had let men die because there were too many wounded and not enough time. She had watched soldiers slip away because she had been forced to make impossible choices about who could be saved and who could not. She would not let another child die if there was anything within her power to prevent it. "Give me your word." Her voice did not waver. "Promise me you will not abandon him again." Magnus went utterly still. For a heartbeat, 2, 3. Evelyn was certain she had pushed too far, that she would feel those terrible claws tear through her flesh before she could draw another breath. Then, slowly, something in his expression changed. The rage did not disappear, but it shifted, redirecting itself inward. "You would bargain for his life. A statement, not a question. Risk your own for a child not of your blood, not of your kind." "Yes." "Why?" The question hung between them, simple and impossibly complex. Evelyn thought of her grandmother's pendant, of the words she had carried with her through war and peace and everything between. "Because it is the right thing to do." Magnus Ironwood stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly he lowered his arms, not in surrender, but in something that might have been acknowledgement. "You have my word." The words seemed to cost him something, dragged up from a depth she could not fathom. "My son will not be abandoned again." Evelyn searched his face for deception and found only exhaustion. The bone weariness of a man fighting battles on too many fronts. Carefully, she transferred the wrapped bundle into his arms. The pup stirred, letting out a weak sound of protest at the movement before settling against the warmth of his father's chest. Magnus looked down at the small form, and for just an instant, the mask of the Alpha King cracked. What Evelyn saw beneath it was grief. "He has no name." Magnus's voice was rough. "Names are given in the ceremony on the first full moon after birth. He was deemed unworthy." The casual cruelty of the words sent anger flaring through Evelyn's chest. "Then perhaps it is time he received one." She spoke before wisdom could stop her. "Every child deserves a name." Magnus's amber eyes lifted to meet hers. The weight of his gaze was almost unbearable, like being pinned by something ancient and unknowable. Then impossibly the corner of his mouth twitched. "Perhaps it is." He turned without another word and began walking toward the deeper forest. Evelyn stood frozen for a moment, uncertain if she had been dismissed or if she was expected to follow. "The moon rises, human." Magnus's voice carried back to her without him turning. "We must reach the fortress before full dark. There are things in these woods that even I would not face willingly." And just like that, her decision was made. Evelyn followed the Alpha King into the gathering darkness, leaving behind everything she had known. With each step, the weight of her choice settled more heavily on her shoulders. She was walking into a world where humans were prey, where survival depended on the whims of creatures who could tear her apart without effort. But the child in Magnus's arms was alive because she had refused to walk away. Whatever came next, she would face it knowing that she had done what was right. Behind them, the sun slipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The Ironwood Fortress rose from the mountainside like something grown rather than built, its towers and walls following the natural contours of the stone with an organic grace that belied its obvious military purpose. Torches lined the approach, their flames dancing in the wind, casting eerie shadows across the snow-covered courtyard. Guards materialized from the darkness as they approached, massive wolves that shifted into armed men with fluid ease. Their eyes widened at the sight of their alpha, widened further at the human woman walking a pace behind him, but none dared to question. A sharp gesture from Magnus sent them scrambling to relay news of his arrival. The fortress gates opened before them, revealing a courtyard bustling with activity. Evelyn glimpsed workshops, training grounds, what might have been a smithy, the infrastructure of a military society, organized and efficient. Men and women in various states of human and wolf form moved through the space with purpose, all of them pausing to stare as their alpha passed with his unexpected companion. The great hall swallowed them whole. Massive timber beams supported a ceiling lost in shadow, while fire pits burned along the center aisle. A woman approached them before they had taken 3 steps inside. Silver-streaked black hair, violet eyes that burned with intelligence, robes embroidered with symbols Evelyn did not recognize. A healer, if the herbs at her belt were any indication. "My alpha." The woman's voice was rich, controlled, hiding whatever shock she felt at the scene before her. "We received word you had returned, with guests." "Not guests, Helena." Magnus shifted his grip on the bundle in his arms. "The child lives, and this human will tend to his care." Helena's violet gaze swept over Evelyn with professional assessment, noting and cataloging in exactly the way Evelyn herself had done to countless patients. Whatever the healer saw, she kept her conclusions to herself. The council will have questions. The council will wait until I am ready to provide answers. Magnus's tone left no room for argument. Prepare chambers adjacent to mine, and send for food. The child needs nourishment. He is injured. He is starving. 3 words that carried enough weight to silence any further questions. Helena bowed her head and disappeared into the depths of the fortress. Magnus resumed walking, and Evelyn followed, acutely aware of the attention focused on them from every corner of the hall. Whispers rose in their wake, quickly suppressed but impossible to ignore entirely. She caught fragments. Human. The crippled heir. Has he lost his mind? They climbed a spiral staircase, passed through corridors lit by flickering torches, and finally emerged into a suite of rooms that spoke of authority rather than luxury. A massive bed covered in furs, weapons mounted on one wall, well used rather than decorative, a desk buried beneath maps and documents, and near a fireplace that crackled with fresh flames, a carved wooden cradle. Magnus crossed to the cradle and laid his son inside with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything Evelyn had witnessed thus far. The pup had shifted during their journey, transforming into a human infant with wisps of silver-white hair and the same extraordinary amber eyes. The change had clearly exhausted him. He slept now, tiny fists curled against his chest, breathing with the shallow rhythm of complete depletion. "You will sleep there." Magnus indicated a door Evelyn had not noticed. The chamber was meant for a consort, though I have never taken one. The implications of that statement hung in the air between them. Evelyn chose not to address them. "He needs milk." She moved toward the cradle, her healer's instincts overriding her uncertainty about her place here, and warmth. When did he last eat? The wet nurses refused after the council's decree. Magnus's voice was flat. No one would touch him. The horror of it washed over Evelyn with nauseating force. Not just abandoned to the elements, but deliberately starved first. A death sentence carried out by degrees, ensuring that even if someone found him, it would likely be too late. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "I need warm milk, a feeding cloth, clean water and soft linens for his skin. He is severely dehydrated and his body temperature is still dangerously low." Magnus studied her for a moment, then moved to the door and issued commands to someone waiting in the corridor. Within minutes, servants appeared bearing everything she had requested, their eyes carefully averted from both the cradle and its unexpected guardian. Evelyn worked with practiced efficiency, warming the milk to the correct temperature, soaking the feeding cloth, testing the liquid against her wrist before bringing it to the infant's lips. At first he was too weak to respond, his tiny mouth slack, his eyes flickering beneath closed lids. "Come on, little one." She kept her voice soft, coaxing. "I know you are tired. I know you have been fighting for so long, but you need to eat, just a little, just enough." The infant's lips moved, twitched. Then, with a sudden desperate hunger, he latched onto the cloth and began to suckle. Evelyn felt tears sting her eyes. She blinked them away, maintaining the steady pressure that would allow the milk to flow without choking him. Behind her, she heard Magnus's sharp intake of breath. "He is eating." The Alpha King's voice was rough with something that might have been wonder. "He is actually eating. He is strong." Evelyn did not look up from her patient. "He has been fighting to survive with nothing but instinct and will. That kind of strength does not come from perfect legs, Alpha. It comes from the heart." For a long moment, Magnus said nothing. When Evelyn finally glanced over her shoulder, she found him standing motionless, staring at his son with an expression of such naked anguish that she had to look away. "His wife died giving birth to him." Helena's voice came from the doorway. The older healer had returned silently, bearing additional supplies. Her name was Isolde. It was an arranged marriage, political, but the Alpha grew to care for her. Her last words were a plea that he protect their son, no matter his form or function. Magnus finished the sentence like a man completing a prayer. "I made her a promise. Today I nearly broke it." The self-loathing in his voice was unmistakable. Whatever else Magnus Ironwood might be, he was a man at war with himself, a leader torn between the demands of tradition and the dictates of his conscience. Helena set down her supplies and moved to examine the infant with professional thoroughness. Evelyn allowed her to work, recognizing a fellow healer's need to assess the situation firsthand. The deformity is congenital. Helena's voice was carefully neutral. The bones did not form correctly in the womb. Our healers have no treatment for such conditions. It can be managed. Evelyn spoke without thinking, then caught herself when both shifters turned to look at her. In humans, similar conditions are treated with manipulation and bracing. It takes time and it requires consistency, but significant improvement is possible. You have done this before? Magnus stepped closer, hope and skepticism warring in his expression. During the war. Evelyn kept her eyes on the infant, who had finally released the feeding cloth and drifted into exhausted sleep. There were children born in the field hospitals, sometimes with complications. We did what we could with limited resources. And were you successful? Sometimes. Evelyn finally met his gaze. I cannot promise miracles, Alpha, but I can promise that I will try everything within my knowledge to help your son. Magnus held her stare for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. That is more than anyone else has offered. A commotion in the corridor interrupted them. Raised voices, heavy footsteps, the unmistakable sound of argument. Magnus's expression hardened into something cold and regal. Stay with the child. It was a command, not a request. Helena, with me. He swept from the room with the older healer at his side, leaving Evelyn alone with the sleeping infant. She sank into the chair beside the cradle, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. The events of the day felt unreal, like fragments of a fever dream. This morning she had been a simple village nurse gathering herbs. Tonight she was inside the fortress of the Alpha King, caring for a royal heir that half the Wolf Kingdom wanted dead. She reached out and touched the infant's tiny hand. His fingers curled reflexively around hers, holding on with surprising strength. I do not know what is going to happen. She whispered the words like a secret shared between conspirators. I do not know if I can keep you safe, or help you walk, or do any of the things I said I would do, but I am going to try. I promise you that much. I am going to try. The baby slept on, his grip never loosening. In the corridor outside, Evelyn could hear the sound of raised voices. The council, presumably, demanding answers that Magnus might not be able to give. She thought about the warning in his eyes when he left. Stay with the child. Not for her protection, she realized now, but for the infant's. There were people in this fortress who wanted him dead. People who believed that imperfection was the same as worthlessness, that a disabled heir was worse than no heir at all. Evelyn had encountered that philosophy before, in different forms, in different places. The cold calculus of survival that valued productivity over humanity. She had fought against it in the field hospitals, arguing for resources to treat those whom others had written off. She had lost those arguments more often than she had won, but she had never stopped fighting. The sound of a door opening made her look up. A man stood in the entrance to Magnus's chambers, tall and lean where the Alpha was broad, his features carrying a family resemblance that marked him as blood kin. Dark hair shot through with silver, a smile that did not reach his eyes. So, his voice was silk over steel, you are the human who convinced my nephew to defy 600 years of tradition. Evelyn rose to her feet, placing herself between the cradle and the newcomer. I am the nurse who found a child abandoned in the snow and chose to save his life. The man's smile widened, and something cold moved behind his eyes. How noble of you. I am Lord Fenris Ironwood, Magnus's uncle, regent during his minority. He moved further into the room, his gaze sliding past her to fix on the cradle. Such a tragedy. What happened to the child? The pack had such hopes for an heir. The way he said it made Evelyn's skin crawl. There was no grief in his voice, no regret, only something that sounded very much like satisfaction. The child is alive, she kept her voice even, and he will remain so. Of course. Fenris's attention shifted back to her, and the weight of his regard made her feel like a mouse being studied by a cat. How fortunate that you were there to intervene. Such a coincidence. I do not believe in coincidence, Lord Fenris. His eyebrows rose slightly. No? Then perhaps you believe in fate. The old stories say that the moon goddess moves us all like pieces on a board. He leaned closer, close enough that she could smell the musk of wolf beneath the civilized exterior. Tell me, little nurse, what piece do you imagine yourself to be? Before Evelyn could respond, Magnus's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. Fenris. The Alpha King stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the light from the corridor. What business brings you to my private quarters uninvited? Something flickered across Fenris's face, gone too quickly to identify. Family concern, nephew. I heard you had returned with the child. And a human. He spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. I came to offer whatever assistance I might provide. Your assistance is noted and unnecessary. Magnus moved into the room, and suddenly the space felt much smaller. The human is under my protection. The child is my heir. Both matters are closed to discussion. Of course, Alpha. Fenris bowed his head in formal acknowledgement, but Evelyn caught the slight curl of his lip as he turned away. I meant no intrusion. I wish only the best for the Ironwood line. He departed without another word, and the tension in the room eased like a held breath finally released. That man, Evelyn said quietly. There is something wrong with him. Magnus moved to the window, staring out at the darkness beyond. Fenris was regent for 12 years, from when my father died until I came of age. He ran this territory with an iron hand. Some say he was better suited to leadership than I. Do you believe that? I believe that he has never forgiven me for surviving long enough to claim my birthright. Magnus turned to face her, and in the firelight, the scar on his face looked like a map of old wars. Watch yourself around him, Evelyn Ashford. My uncle is not accustomed to being denied what he wants. It was the first time he had used her name. The weight of it settled over her like a cloak, marking her as something more than just the human or the nurse. A person, in his eyes. An individual. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because you saved my son's life. And because you asked me for something I had no right to withhold. A promise to protect my own child. He moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. I do not forget debts, Evelyn. Or kindnesses. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. Then he was gone, and Evelyn was alone once more with the sleeping infant and the crackle of the fire and the weight of too many unanswered questions. She should have been afraid. Instead, she felt something that might have been purpose. She had come to this forest looking for feverfew. She had found something far more valuable, a chance to make a difference, a child who needed her, a fight worth joining. She settled back into the chair beside the cradle, positioned where she could see both the infant and the door. Old habits from the field hospitals. The fire burned low. The wind howled outside the fortress walls, and somewhere in the darkness of the corridors, footsteps echoed. Patrolling, perhaps, or hunting. 3 days passed in a blur of feeding schedules and therapeutic exercises. Evelyn threw herself into her work, pushing aside questions about her future in favor of the immediate needs of her patient. The infant responded better than she had dared hope. His appetite increased. His color improved. She fashioned a simple splint for his malformed legs, adjusting it daily based on his progress. Magnus visited each evening. He would stand beside the cradle, looking down at his son with an expression caught between wonder and grief. Sometimes he spoke, sharing fragments of pack history. More often, he simply watched. On the 4th night, Helena came to Evelyn's chamber with a candle and a worried expression. There is something you should know. The older healer kept her voice low, though they were alone. Something about the council's decision regarding the child. Evelyn set aside the notes she had been making on the infant's progress. Tell me. The decree to abandon the heir was not the council's idea. Helena's violet eyes were troubled. Oh, they supported it readily enough. Our traditions are clear on the matter of imperfect offspring, but the suggestion came from elsewhere. Fenris. Helena's silence was confirmation enough. I suspected as much. Evelyn felt cold certainty settle in her chest. He stands to gain if the heir is removed. As the Alpha's nearest male relative, he would be next in line for succession. More than that. Helena moved closer, her voice dropping further. Fenris was regent during Magnus's childhood. He made alliances, accumulated debts, built a network of loyalists throughout the pack. There are those who believe he should never have given up power at all. Does Magnus know? Magnus knows many things. Helena's tone was careful. But suspicion is not proof, and Fenris is clever enough to keep his hands clean. Evelyn thought about the man she had met in Magnus's chambers, the cold calculation behind his pleasant smile. Not just clever, she suspected, patient, the kind of predator who waited for the perfect moment to strike. What can I do? Survive. Helena placed a hand on her shoulder, the touch surprisingly gentle. Care for the child. Watch for danger. And trust no one whose loyalty you have not personally tested. She paused at the door. Including me, girl. I have lived long enough in this court to know that trust is a luxury few can afford." After the healer left, Evelyn lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to the soft sounds of the infant sleeping. She had walked into something far more dangerous than she had realized. Not just a child in need of care, but a political battleground. But she had made her choice. She had stood in that snowy clearing and refused to let an innocent die. She would not stop refusing now. The library was not difficult to find. Evelyn had grown adept at moving through the corridors unnoticed, timing her journeys to avoid the busiest hours. She was looking for information. About the child's condition, yes, but also about this place, these people, the history that had shaped them. It was the historical archives that captured her attention most thoroughly. She was searching for information about the border conflict when she stumbled across medical records from the final year of the war, field reports, casualty lists, treatment logs. Her fingers froze on a particular page, a report dated 5 years prior, describing a battle near the Eastern Front. Heavy casualties on both sides. Among the wounded, the Alpha Heir, Magnus Ironwood. Injuries, severe lacerations to face and torso, blood loss critical. Treatment administered by field medics. Status at evacuation, unconscious but stable. And there, in a notation at the bottom of the page, initial treatment provided by human medical personnel. Identity unknown due to records lost in subsequent fire. Evelyn's hands began to shake. She remembered that night. The chaos of the field hospital, wounded from both sides pouring in faster than they could be treated. The desperate shortage of supplies, of personnel, of time. And the shifter soldier they had brought in, more dead than alive, his face torn open from temple to jaw by what looked like a blade strike. She had worked on him for 6 hours, stitching and cleaning and praying to every deity she did not believe in, while bombs exploded outside and the world fell apart around them. She had not known his name, had barely registered his features through all the blood and damage. He had been unconscious when they finally evacuated him to a shifter field station. She had never known if he survived. The scar on Magnus Ironwood's face, the one that ran from his right temple to his jaw, she had given him that scar. Not the wound itself, but the careful stitching that had closed it, that had kept him alive long enough to reach proper healers. Their meeting in the forest had not been coincidence. They had been connected long before either of them realized it. Evelyn stared at the page for a long moment, her mind racing through the implications. Then, carefully, she closed the archive and returned it to its shelf. This changed things. How exactly, she was not yet certain. But the universe, it seemed, had been weaving threads between them for far longer than a single encounter in the snow. She thought of her grandmother's pendant, the crescent moon cradling a star. "The moon goddess moves us all like pieces on a board," Fenris had said. For the first time since arriving at the fortress, Evelyn began to wonder what game they might be playing, and whether she had been a piece in it all along. She returned to her chambers to find Magnus waiting by the cradle, his son cradled in his arms. The infant was awake, amber eyes fixed on his father's face with the intensity that Evelyn had come to recognize as characteristic. He smiled at me. Magnus's voice was rough with emotion. I was singing an old lullaby my mother used to sing, and he smiled. Evelyn moved to stand beside them, looking down at the tiny face that had already claimed so much of her heart. The infant's mouth curved upward again, as if to demonstrate. "He knows you," she said softly. "He knows you are his father." Magnus was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I have decided on a name, if you think it's suitable." Evelyn waited, sensing the weight of the moment. "Asher." Magnus looked down at his son. "It means blessed, because despite everything that has happened, despite all the forces arrayed against him, he is here, he is alive, he is a blessing I do not deserve." Asher. Evelyn tested the name, felt how it fit the child in a way that seemed right and inevitable. "It suits him." Magnus nodded slowly. "Then it is decided." Outside the window, the moon rose over the mountains, bathing the chamber in silver light. Asher yawned, his tiny fists uncurling as sleep began to claim him. Magnus laid him gently in the cradle, tucking the blankets around his small form with a tenderness that seemed at odds with everything he was supposed to be. A warrior king, cradling his broken child like the most precious thing in the world. Evelyn watched them and felt something shift inside her chest, something that might have been the beginning of understanding, or perhaps something even more dangerous. But that was a question for another day. For now, there was a child who needed her, a king who was learning to be a father, and a mystery connecting them both that she had only begun to unravel. The future would come soon enough, bringing its challenges and its dangers. Tonight, there was peace. And that, she had learned long ago, was worth treasuring whenever it could be found. 6 weeks had passed since Evelyn Ashford walked into the Ironwood Fortress with nothing but the clothes on her back and the stubborn conviction that every life was worth fighting for. 6 weeks of sleepless nights and small victories, of learning the rhythms of a world that had never been meant for her kind. Asher was thriving. The transformation was nothing short of remarkable. The infant who had been hours from death now kicked and squirmed with the restless energy of any healthy child. At nearly 6 months old, his amber eyes tracked movement with sharp intelligence, following Evelyn's face when she spoke, reaching for her hair when she leaned close enough. The specialized splints she had crafted were doing their work, slowly coaxing his malformed legs toward proper alignment. He would never run like other wolves. Evelyn had been honest about that from the beginning. But he might walk. He might even manage a modified gait that would allow him independence. Every day brought new progress, new hope, new evidence that the Council's death sentence had been premature at best, murderous at worst. Magnus came to them each evening without fail. The Alpha King would arrive as the sun dipped below the mountain peaks, still wearing the weight of the day's decisions on his broad shoulders. He would stand beside the cradle and watch his son sleep, or hold him carefully against his chest while Evelyn demonstrated the therapeutic exercises that had become Asher's daily routine. In those quiet hours, with firelight dancing across the stone walls and the fortress settling into its nightly rhythms, something had begun to grow between them. Not romance, not the breathless passion of youth, but something perhaps more valuable: respect, understanding, the recognition of kindred spirits who had both seen too much of the world's cruelty to believe in easy answers. "Tell me about the war," Magnus asked one evening, seated in the chair by the fire while Evelyn massaged Asher's legs with practiced hands. "Your war, the one that left its marks on you." Evelyn's fingers did not pause in their work. "What makes you think it left marks?" "I know the look." Magnus's voice was low, contemplative. "I see it in my own mirror every morning. The look of someone who has stood in places where death was the only certain thing." For a long moment, Evelyn said nothing. She finished the exercise, wrapped Asher's legs in their padded splints, and settled him in his cradle before turning to face the Alpha King. "I was 23 when I volunteered for the field hospitals. Young, idealistic, convinced that I could make a difference. And did you?" "Sometimes." She moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. "Sometimes I held a man's hand while he died because there was nothing else I could do. Sometimes I saved someone who should have been beyond saving. The war did not care about my idealism. It simply demanded that I keep working until there was no one left to save." Magnus rose from his chair and crossed to stand beside her. His reflection in the glass was a shadow of darkness against the white world beyond. "I found something in the archives," Evelyn said quietly. "Medical records from the final year of the war. A report about a wounded Alpha heir treated by human medical personnel." Magnus was silent for a moment, then he nodded slowly. "I suspected from the moment you challenged me in that clearing." His amber eyes held hers with unwavering intensity. A human woman with the courage to face down an Alpha King does not come from ordinary circumstances. When I saw your hands, the way you moved, the certainty in your voice when you spoke of healing, I began to wonder. The records you found confirmed what I had already begun to believe. You knew it was me, the one who treated you that night. I remember almost nothing of it, only pain, and a voice telling me to hold on. When I woke in the shifter medical camp days later, they told me a human nurse had kept me alive long enough to be evacuated. He touched the scar on his face. I have carried your work with me ever since. Why did you not say anything? Because I was not certain you remembered, and because some debts are better acknowledged through action than through words. The silence between them stretched, filled with the crackle of the fire and Asher's soft breathing from his cradle. Evelyn found herself acutely aware of Magnus's presence, the warmth radiating from his body, the scent of pine and wilderness that clung to him like a second skin. "I made a choice that night," she said finally. "The same choice I made in the forest with Asher, the only choice I know how to make." Magnus nodded slowly. "And I made a choice when I allowed the council to take my son, a choice I will spend the rest of my life trying to undo." His jaw tightened, the scar on his face standing out in sharp relief. When they came to me with their decree, I told myself I was thinking of the pack, that a disabled heir would invite challenge from our enemies, would weaken our position, would lead to deaths far greater in number than a single infant. But the truth is simpler and uglier. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. I was afraid of fighting the council, afraid of what it would cost me. I told myself I was being pragmatic when I was simply being a coward. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded. Evelyn understood what it had cost him to speak those words. She had made her own share of impossible choices during the war, had rationalized her own failures in the quiet hours before dawn. "You are here now," she said. "That is what matters. Is it enough?" Evelyn looked at the cradle where Asher slept, his small chest rising and falling with peaceful rhythm. "I do not know, but it is a start." Magnus followed her gaze, and something in his expression softened. For the first time since she had met him, he looked less like the fearsome Alpha King and more like simply a father, uncertain, hopeful, determined to do better. It would have to be enough. The days that followed brought a fragile peace to Evelyn's existence within the fortress. Helena had become something approaching an ally, sharing her knowledge of shifter medicine and asking pointed questions about human techniques in return. Captain Theron, the commander of Magnus's personal guard, had shifted from open hostility to grudging acceptance after witnessing her dedication to Asher's care. But not everyone welcomed her presence. Whispers followed her through the corridors. The human nurse, the outsider who had bewitched their alpha. Evelyn learned to ignore the hostile stares, the conversations that fell silent when she approached. Fenris Ironwood was far more subtle. The alpha's uncle maintained an air of perfect civility whenever their paths crossed. His smiles were warm, his words carefully chosen, his concern for Asher's well-being seemingly genuine. But Evelyn had learned during the war to trust her instincts about people, and every instinct she possessed screamed warning whenever Fenris was near. She began to watch him more carefully, noting the patterns of his movements through the fortress, the visitors who came to his private chambers at odd hours, the meaningful glances exchanged with certain council members during public gatherings. A picture was forming, piece by piece, of a man who had never stopped wanting the power that had been taken from him when Magnus came of age. "You are playing a dangerous game, little nurse," Helena warned her one afternoon, finding Evelyn in the library where she had been searching for information about the Ironwood family history. "Fenris has eyes everywhere in this fortress. If he suspects you are watching him, he will act. I am simply being cautious. Caution looks different from investigation." Helena's violet eyes were troubled. "I have served 3 generations of Ironwood alphas. I have seen men like Fenris before. They are patient, they plan, and when they strike, they do not miss. What would you have me do?" Evelyn set aside the book she had been reading. "Ignore the threat and hope it goes away?" "I would have you survive." Helena moved closer, lowering her voice. "Whatever Fenris is planning, you cannot stop it alone. You have no power here, no allies of significance, no understanding of the currents that move beneath the surface of pack politics. Then help me understand." Helena was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, she nodded. "There is a delegation arriving for the Blood Moon gathering in 3 days. Alpha Draven of the Northern Reaches and his retinue. Draven and the Ironwood Pack have been enemies for generations, but the current peace requires these formal meetings." "And Fenris?" "Has been corresponding with someone in Draven's court. I do not know the content of those messages, but I know they exist." The information settled into Evelyn's mind like a puzzle piece finding its place. Fenris was building an alliance with an enemy alpha. The implications were staggering. "Have you told Magnus?" "I have told him what I can prove, which is very little." Helena's expression was weary. "Fenris is careful. His letters are coded, his meetings private, his loyalists bound by oaths that would mean death to break. Without concrete evidence, accusing him would only reveal that we suspect something. So we wait. We watch," Helena corrected, "and we protect what can be protected." The Blood Moon gathering arrived with all the ceremony and tension such events demanded. Evelyn watched from a window as the Northern Reaches delegation approached the fortress, their banners snapping in the cold wind, their escort numbering far more warriors than any diplomatic mission required. Alpha Draven rode at the head of the column, Even from a distance, Evelyn could see why he commanded such fear and respect among the shifter territories. He was tall even by wolf standards, his hair prematurely white, despite a face that showed no more than 40 years, his bearing that of a man who had never known a moment's doubt about his own authority. "You will remain in our chambers during the formal gatherings," Magnus had informed her that morning, his tone making it clear this was not a request. "Your presence would be seen as a provocation by certain members of the delegation." Evelyn had not argued. She understood political necessity, even when it chafed against her pride. The important thing was Asher's safety, not her own standing among creatures who would never truly accept her regardless. But she watched. Through windows, from shadowed corners, through servants who had begun to warm to her despite their initial reservations. The Blood Moon Feast was a spectacle of barely contained aggression dressed in the trappings of civilization. Wolves from both packs gathered in the Great Hall, their formal attire doing little to disguise the predatory tension that crackled through the space like lightning before a storm. Draven sat at Magnus's right hand, the position of honored guest, though his icy eyes held no warmth. Their conversation carried fragments that reached Evelyn's hiding spot in the gallery above. "Your heir shows remarkable resilience." Draven's voice was silk over steel. "I had heard he was not expected to survive infancy. My son is stronger than many believed." Magnus's response was carefully neutral, "As are all who carry Ironwood blood." "Indeed." Draven's smile did not reach his eyes. "Though strength comes in many forms, does it not? Some lead from the front, others require more creative paths to power." The pointed glance toward Fenris did not escape Evelyn's notice. Nor, she suspected, did it escape Magnus's. The gathering continued into the night. Evelyn eventually retreated to her chambers, checking on Asher before settling into the chair by his cradle with a book she could not concentrate on. The fortress hummed with activity below, the sounds of revelry and political maneuvering bleeding through the stone walls. Sleep found her eventually, restless and filled with dreams of shadows moving through darkness. She woke to the sound of the door opening, not the main door to Magnus's chambers, which would have required passing his guards. The servant's entrance, the one that had been sealed and was supposed to require a key held only by the Alpha himself. Evelyn's hand found the dagger beneath her pillow in the same instant her eyes adjusted to the darkness. 3 figures, moving with the fluid grace of wolves in human form, heading directly for Asher's cradle. Time seemed to slow. She had seconds to act, seconds to decide between screaming for help that might not arrive in time, or facing 3 shifter assassins with nothing but a blade and the desperate determination of a woman who had sworn to protect the child in her care. There was no decision to make. There had never been one. Evelyn moved. The first assassin fell before the others realized she was awake. Her dagger found the soft spot beneath his jaw, driven upward with the precise knowledge of anatomy that had once helped her save lives and now served to end one. He collapsed without a sound, his body hitting the floor as Evelyn was already spinning toward the second attacker. This one was faster. His claws had partially emerged, slashing toward her face with killing intent. Evelyn ducked under the strike, feeling the wind of its passage across her cheek, and drove her elbow into his throat with all the force she could muster. He staggered back, choking, and she followed with a kick to his knee that dropped him to the ground. The third assassin had reached the cradle. Evelyn threw herself across the room, abandoning any pretense of skill in favor of raw desperation. She crashed into the attacker from behind, sending them both sprawling away from Asher's sleeping form. They hit the ground hard, rolling, grappling for position. The assassin was stronger. Of course she was stronger. She was a wolf, and Evelyn was merely human. But Evelyn had survived 3 years in field hospitals, where violence was as common as bandages, where she had learned that determination could compensate for many disadvantages. She fought dirty, fingers in eyes, teeth in flesh, every brutal trick she had learned from soldiers who understood that fair fights were for people who could afford to lose. The assassin's claws raked across her back, opening furrows of fire from shoulder to hip. Evelyn screamed but did not release her grip on the woman's throat. Blood, hot and wet, soaked through her nightdress. The pain was enormous, threatening to drag her down into darkness. Asher began to cry. The sound cut through Evelyn's fading consciousness like a blade. She could not pass out, could not fail, could not let this monster reach the child who had already survived so much. With the last of her strength, she drove her forehead into the assassin's nose. Bone crunched. The woman's grip loosened. Evelyn used the momentary advantage to slam her opponent's head against the stone floor once, twice, 3 times, until the body beneath her went limp. The second assassin was rising, his damaged throat gurgling with rage. Evelyn tried to stand and found her legs would not cooperate. Too much blood lost, too much damage taken. She crawled instead, placing herself between the cradle and the approaching threat, her dagger held in a hand that trembled with exhaustion. "If I die," she thought with strange clarity, "at least I die fighting." The assassin raised his clawed hand. A roar shook the chamber, primal and devastating, and Magnus Ironwood crashed through the door like a force of nature. He was half-shifted, neither fully man nor wolf, his body wreathed in shadow and fury. The assassin barely had time to turn before Magnus was upon him, and what followed was too savage, too raw, to be called combat. It was execution. When it was finished, Magnus stood among the bodies of his enemies, chest heaving, his amber eyes blazing with a light that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the mortal world. Slowly the rage receded. The half-shift faded. The man emerged from the beast. "Evelyn." He was at her side in an instant, his hands gentle despite the violence they had just delivered. She felt herself being lifted, cradled against a chest still hot with battle fury. "Asher," she managed to whisper. "Is he safe?" "He is safe." Magnus's voice was rough with emotion. "Because of you, Helena, now!" What followed was a blur of pain and voices. Helena's face swimming in and out of focus, the sharp sting of healing salves, the warmth of bandages being wrapped around her torn flesh. Through it all, Magnus remained beside her, his hand holding hers with a grip that anchored her to consciousness. "The wounds are deep." Helena's voice seemed to come from very far away. "But clean. No infection. She will scar." "Scars are just stories written on skin," Evelyn heard herself say, the words borrowed from a conversation that felt like it had happened in another lifetime. "Sleep." Magnus's command carried the weight of the alpha. "We will speak when you wake." Evelyn wanted to argue. There was so much to say, so many questions demanding answers. But her body had reached its limit, and even her stubborn will could not override the simple need for rest. She slept. She woke to daylight streaming through the windows, and Magnus sitting in the chair beside her bed. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his jaw shadowed with stubble. But he was awake, watching over her with the same intensity she had seen when he looked at Asher. "How long?" 2 days. He reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, the gesture oddly tender. "Helena kept you sedated while the worst of the healing occurred. You lost a great deal of blood." Evelyn tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Fire raced along her back, following the paths the assassin's claws had carved. "Easy." Magnus's hand pressed gently against her shoulder, keeping her still. "The wounds are closed, but not yet healed. You need rest." "The assassins, who sent them?" "We are still investigating." Magnus's expression darkened. "But I have my suspicions." "Fenris." He did not deny it. "The assassins were from a minor family with ties to my uncle. They claim to have acted alone, motivated by devotion to tradition. I do not believe them." "Can you prove his involvement?" "Not yet. And without proof, I cannot move against him openly without fracturing the pack." Magnus's jaw tightened with frustration. He has positioned himself carefully. Too many of the older families still remember his time as regent with fondness. They would see action against him as tyranny rather than justice. "So we wait while he tries again?" "No. We prepare." Magnus rose from the chair and moved to the window. "But there is something you should know first, something that changes the nature of our situation." He turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. "Your pendant. During the attack, it was damaged. Helena examined it while you were unconscious. The casing had cracked, revealing a hidden compartment, and inside was something remarkable." Evelyn's hand moved instinctively to her throat, finding bandages where the familiar weight of silver should have been. "The symbol engraved inside the pendant is the royal seal of the Silver Moon bloodline." Magnus's voice was careful, measured. A line that was thought to have been extinguished 200 years ago in the Great Purge. "That is not possible." Evelyn's mind raced. "My grandmother was a human woman. She lived in a cottage in the countryside. She had no connection to shifter politics. The Silver Moon wolves were known for their ability to pass as human." Magnus crossed back to her bedside. "They were healers primarily. Their bloodline carried gifts that made them invaluable to the packs they served, but those same gifts made them targets during the wars of consolidation. The dominant packs hunted them to extinction, or so everyone believed. You are saying my grandmother was a wolf? I am saying your grandmother may have been a descendant of a wolf lineage that learned to hide its nature to survive. Helena has examined your blood. There are traces of shifter heritage, dormant but present. Not enough for you to shift, but enough to explain certain things. What things? Your ability to sense danger before it manifests. The way my son responds to you as though you were Pack. The fact that you survived wounds that should have killed any ordinary human. Evelyn lay in stunned silence, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything she had believed about herself and her history. Her grandmother had always been mysterious about the past, always changing the subject when asked about family history, always insisting that some secrets were better left buried. You carry healing in your hands, Evelyn. Your gentleness is not weakness. Had she been speaking literally? This changes things, Evelyn said finally. Politically, I mean. Yes, Magnus agreed. If your lineage can be verified, you are no longer simply a human under my protection. You are the last known descendant of a royal bloodline with legitimate claim to status within shifter society. It would not make you equal to an alpha, but it would make you far more than a servant or a curiosity. And it would make Fenris's position more difficult. Considerably. He cannot use your humanity as a weapon against me if you are recognized as carrying noble shifter blood, but it also makes you a greater threat in his eyes. Before you were an inconvenience, now you are an obstacle to be removed. The weight of this new reality settled over Evelyn like a physical burden. She had walked into the Ironwood fortress expecting danger, but the danger she had anticipated was simple. Violence, hostility, the risk of a quick death at the hands of creatures who saw her as prey. This was something far more complex. A web of politics and ancient bloodlines and rivalries that stretched back centuries. What happens now? Now you heal. Magnus's voice brooked no argument. And then we plan. He moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. Evelyn, there is one more thing. During the attack, when you placed yourself between my son and his killers, knowing you could not win, knowing you would likely die, why did you not call for help first? The question caught her off guard. She considered it for a moment before answering. There was no time, and even if there had been, I could not be certain help would arrive before they reached Asher. The only thing I could control was my own body, my own actions. You were prepared to die for him. I made a promise, to him and to you, that I would protect him. Evelyn met Magnus's gaze steadily. I do not make promises lightly, and I do not break them at all. Something shifted in the Alpha King's expression, something that might have been admiration or perhaps recognition of a kindred spirit. Rest, he said again, softer this time. We will speak more when you are stronger. The door closed behind him, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts and the throbbing pain of her wounds. She stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened, everything that had been revealed. Her grandmother, a hidden wolf. Her blood, carrying traces of an ancient lineage. Her presence here, perhaps not coincidence, but destiny of a kind she had never believed in. She thought of Asher, sleeping peacefully in his cradle, unaware of the forces gathering around him. She thought of Magnus, bearing the weight of leadership while enemies circled from within and without. She thought of Fenris, patient and calculating, waiting for his moment to strike. And she thought of herself, Evelyn Ashford, nurse, survivor. Now apparently, something more. Sleep claimed her before she could reach any conclusions. But even in dreams, she could feel the world shifting beneath her feet, old certainties crumbling to reveal new and terrifying possibilities. The days of recovery stretched into weeks. Evelyn pushed herself harder than Helena recommended, ignoring the protests of healing flesh, to resume her care of Asher as soon as she could stand. The child had been upset by her absence, fussy and difficult in ways he had never been before. He calmed immediately when she returned to his side, his small hand grasping her finger with desperate strength. I am here, she whispered to him. I am not going anywhere. Word of the attack had spread through the fortress like wildfire. The official story was that rogue elements had attempted to harm the heir, but everyone knew there was more to it than that. Evelyn felt the shift in how people looked at her. Before, she had been an oddity. Now she was something else. A survivor. A fighter. a woman who had killed wolves with her bare hands to protect a child not of her blood. Helena had confirmed that the symbol in Evelyn's pendant was genuine, the silver moon royal seal, unmistakable to anyone who knew their history. The information had been shared only with Magnus and Captain Theron, but Evelyn knew it could not remain secret forever. Already there were whispers about the human who healed too quickly, who sensed danger before it arrived, who had somehow survived wounds that should have been fatal. Fenris had not shown his face since the attack. His absence was conspicuous, a silence that spoke louder than any protestation of innocence. Magnus had placed him under unofficial observation, guards who reported his every movement, visitors who were noted and catalogued, but still no proof, still no evidence concrete enough to act upon. He is waiting. Magnus observed one evening, standing by the window while Evelyn fed Asher his evening meal, calculating his next move. The failed assassination has made him cautious, but it has not deterred him. What options do we have? Few that do not risk tearing the pack apart. Magnus turned to face her. But there is one possibility, a way to strengthen our position and weaken his at the same time. Tell me. Magnus was silent for a long moment, his amber eyes searching her face as though looking for something only he could see. Among my people, there is a ritual called the Sword Oath. It was once used to formalize alliances between clans, binding them together through shared blood and mutual obligation. In recent centuries, it has fallen out of use, replaced by more political arrangements. But it has never been abolished from our laws. What does this have to do with our situation? Everything. Magnus stepped closer. The Sword Oath can be invoked between an alpha and any individual of sufficient status. It creates a bond of absolute equality, making the oath-taker a partner in leadership rather than a subordinate. Evelyn's breath caught. Are you suggesting what I think you are suggesting? I am asking if you would consider entering into such an arrangement with me. Magnus's voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful control he was exercising over his emotions. Not out of romance or sentiment, though I will not pretend there is nothing between us, but because it would serve both our interests and protect those we care about. You want a political alliance? I want a partner, someone I can trust absolutely, someone who has proven their loyalty and their strength. He gestured toward Asher. My son needs a mother, not a nursemaid, but someone with the authority to protect him in my absence. Someone the pack will accept because they must, not because they choose to. Evelyn sat in silence, Asher drowsy in her arms, her mind racing through the implications. A formal bond with the Alpha King, status within the pack, protection that went beyond Magnus's personal word, but also exposure, scrutiny, the weight of expectations she had never sought and was not certain she could bear. This is not a decision to make lightly, she said finally. You are asking me to commit my entire life to your world. I am asking you to consider it. Magnus replied, nothing more. He moved toward the door. You have until the next full moon. After that, Fenris will act again. I can feel it. And when he does, I want us to be ready. The door closed behind him, and Evelyn was left alone with a sleeping child and a choice that would determine the course of her entire future. She looked down at Asher's peaceful face, his silver-white hair gleaming in the firelight. She thought of Magnus, carrying burdens that would crush a lesser man, fighting enemies on every front. She thought of Fenris, patient and deadly, waiting in the shadows, and she thought of herself. The woman she had been before the war, the woman she had become, the woman she might yet be, if she had the courage to reach for it. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside the fortress walls, and somewhere in the darkness, the future waited, patient as any predator, ready to reveal itself in its own time. In another wing of the fortress, far from where Evelyn wrestled with her decision, Lord Fenris Ironwood stood at the window of his private chambers and watched the moon traverse the winter sky. His face was a mask of perfect calm, but behind his eyes, calculations spun like the gears of some vast and terrible machine. The assassination attempt had failed. 3 of his agents, dead at the hands of a human woman and his nephew. The news had transformed the outsider nurse into something approaching a legend. She had killed wolves with her bare hands. She had survived wounds that should have been fatal. And now, to make matters worse, she carried the blood of the Silver Moon. Fenris had not believed the reports at first. The Silver Moon lineage had been exterminated 2 centuries ago, But here was this woman with the royal seal of a dead bloodline and traces of shifter heritage in her veins. It changed everything. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Fenris composed his features before responding. "Enter." The messenger who slipped through the door was one of his trusted operatives, a young wolf named Garrett. "My lord." The messenger kept his voice low. "Word from the northern reaches. Alpha Draven wishes to accelerate the timeline." Fenris turned from the window, his expression sharpening. "Accelerate? The full moon is barely a fortnight away. Our plans are not yet complete. The situation has changed." Garrett produced a folded paper, sealed with Draven's personal mark. "The Alpha believes the human woman poses a greater threat than anticipated. If Magnus binds her to him through the sword oath, her status will be legitimized beyond challenge." Fenris took the letter and broke the seal, scanning its contents with growing unease. "He wants to move during the winter solstice gathering," Fenris said slowly, "before Magnus can complete any bonding ritual. The delegation from the northern reaches will include twice the usual number of warriors," Garrett confirmed. "When the signal is given, they will secure the Great Hall while our forces move against Magnus directly. And the heir? Alpha Draven leaves that matter to your discretion." Fenris read the letter again, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. Draven was offering him exactly what he had always wanted, the Alpha position that should have been his by right. "Tell Draven I agree to his terms." Fenris folded the letter and consigned it to the flames. The solstice gathering will be the end of Magnus Ironwood and his defective heir. Garrett bowed and departed as silently as he had come. Alone once more, Fenris allowed his mask to slip. A smile spread across his features, genuine and utterly devoid of warmth. Let the fools play at love and loyalty. In the end, only power endured. 3 days passed. 3 days of caring for Asher, of avoiding Magnus, of turning the question over and over in her mind like a stone being polished by endless water. She found herself in the library on the third evening, surrounded by histories and treaties, looking for answers that perhaps did not exist. "You are troubled," Helena's voice came from behind her. Evelyn turned to find the older healer settling into a chair nearby, her violet eyes sharp with understanding. "Magnus told you about his proposal." "He did not need to tell me." Helena's smile was knowing. "The man has been pacing his chambers like a caged wolf for 3 days. It was not difficult to guess the cause." Evelyn set aside the book she had been reading. "What would you advise?" "That depends." Helena leaned forward. "What do you want, Evelyn Ashford? Not what is sensible or strategic or proper. What do you actually want?" The question cut through all of Evelyn's carefully constructed analysis. She opened her mouth to give a considered response and found herself saying something entirely different. "I want to belong somewhere." The words emerged raw and unguarded. "I want to stop being an outsider looking in. I want to matter to someone, to something beyond my utility." "Then perhaps you have your answer." "It is not that simple." "No," Helena agreed. "It never is, but the complicated answers are usually the right ones." She rose from her chair, pausing beside Evelyn's seat. "Whatever you decide it for yourself. Not for Magnus, not for Asher, not for the pack or the politics, or any of the 1,000 pressures bearing down on you. The only choice worth making is one you can live with when everything else is stripped away." Helena departed, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts. She sat in the library until the candles burned low, until the fortress fell silent around her, until the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the windows. And when she finally rose, she knew what her answer would be. Morning came slowly to the fortress. Evelyn had not slept. Her mind was too full, her heart too heavy with decisions that could not be unmade. She found Magnus in the training yard, working through combat forms with dedication that spoke of sleepless nights. His movements were fluid despite his fatigue. Evelyn watched from the colonnade before he noticed her presence. "You have made your decision. It was not a question." Magnus lowered his practice blade. "Whatever you have chosen, I will accept it." Evelyn stepped into the yard until she stood before him. The cold bit at her cheeks, but she barely felt it. "I have questions first," she said, "before I give you my answer." "Ask." "If I agree to this bond, what happens to my autonomy?" "The sword oath creates equality, not subordination." Magnus met her gaze directly. "You would be my partner. Your voice would carry the same weight as mine. Your decisions regarding Asher would be beyond challenge. And if we disagree, then we argue, we debate, we find a way forward together. I have no interest in a partner who simply tells me what I want to hear." Evelyn nodded. "What about the physical expectations? The sword oath requires shared blood, not shared beds. What happens beyond the ritual is our business. I will not pressure you for anything you do not freely choose. One more question. Evelyn took a breath. What happens when Asher is grown? Do I simply fade into the background? Magnus stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his amber eyes. You are not a tool, Evelyn. You are not a convenience or a political asset. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. You are a woman who walked into impossible circumstances and met them with courage I have rarely seen in anyone, wolf or human. Whatever happens with Asher, whatever happens with the pack, I would want you beside me. Not because you are useful, but because you are you. The words hung in this cold air between them. Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. Some wall she had built long ago, some defense against hoping for things that might never come, began to crack. Then my answer is yes. Magnus stared at her for a moment, as though unable to believe what he had heard. Yes? Yes. Evelyn allowed herself a small smile. I will take the sword oath with you. I will be your partner in this endeavor. Something broke open in Magnus's expression. Relief. Hope. The lifting of a burden he had been carrying alone. The ritual must be performed before witnesses. Helena, Captain Theron. How soon? As soon as you are ready. Evelyn thought of Asher. She thought of Fenris, planning in the shadows. She thought of the future, uncertain and dangerous and somehow worth fighting for. Tonight, before anything else can go wrong. Magnus nodded. Tonight it is. He reached out and took her hand, the gesture simple and strangely powerful. Two people standing in a snow-covered training yard, agreeing to bind their fates together against enemies known and unknown. It was not romance. It was not love, at least not yet. But it was something real and solid and true. And in a world of shadows and deception, truth was perhaps the most valuable thing of all. The preparations consumed the remainder of the day. Helena gathered materials while Captain Theron secured a private chamber. Evelyn spent the afternoon with Asher, memorizing every detail of his face. By nightfall, everything was ready. The ritual chamber was small but ancient, its walls carved with symbols that predated the Ironwood dynasty. Torches flickered, casting dancing shadows across stone that had witnessed oaths and betrayals beyond counting. Magnus stood in the center of the space, dressed in the traditional leathers of his ancestors. A blade lay across his palms, old and well-used, its edge still keen despite its age. This sword belonged to the first Ironwood Alpha, he said as Evelyn entered. It has witnessed every significant oath in our family's history. Tonight it will witness ours. Evelyn approached, acutely aware of Helena and Theron watching from the edges of the chamber. She wore a simple dress of dark blue, her pale hair loose around her shoulders, her grandmother's pendant restored to its place against her heart. The ritual was straightforward. Magnus explained each step before performing it, ensuring she understood what was being asked and what was being given. When he drew the blade across his palm, she did the same without hesitation, watching their blood mingle and fall upon the ancient stone. My blood is your blood. Magnus spoke the words as though reciting a sacred text. Your enemies are my enemies. Your honor is my honor. Until the moon ceases to rise, until my bones return to the earth, I am bound to you. Evelyn repeated the oath, her voice steady, despite the enormity of what she was pledging. The words felt ancient and powerful, echoing in the chamber as though the walls themselves were listening. When the final phrase left her lips, something changed. She felt it like a shift in the air, a vibration that resonated through her bones. Her blood seemed to sing in her veins, responding to something deep and primal that had been awakened by the ritual. Helena gasped softly from her position by the wall. Her eyes, the healer whispered. Look at her eyes. Evelyn turned to find a polished bronze mirror mounted on one wall. Her reflection stared back at her, familiar in every way except one. Her eyes, normally a pale gray blue, now held flecks of silver that caught the torchlight like tiny stars. The silver moon bloodline, Helena breathed. The oath has awakened what lay dormant. Magnus moved to stand beside her, his reflection joining hers in the ancient mirror. You are pack now, he said quietly, in blood and in bond. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Evelyn stared at her transformed reflection, at the eyes that marked her as something new and strange and powerful. Whatever comes next. She had a feeling they would not have to wait long to find out. The silver flecks in Evelyn's eyes had not faded by morning. She stood before the mirror in her chamber, studying her transformed reflection as pale dawn light crept through the windows. The woman who stared back at her was familiar in most ways. The same pale hair, now slightly disheveled from a restless night, the same determined set to her jaw, the same calloused hands that had healed so many and killed when necessary. But the eyes were different. Where once they had been simply gray-blue, now they held stars. Tiny points of silver light that caught and reflected even the dimmest illumination, marking her as something other than purely human. The sword oath had changed more than her legal status within the pack. A soft knock at the door announced Helena's arrival. The older healer entered with her usual brisk efficiency, but paused when she saw Evelyn's face in the mirror. "They have not dimmed," Helena observed, moving closer to examine the silver flecks. "If anything, they seem brighter than last night. What does it mean?" "I am not entirely certain." Helena's violet eyes were thoughtful. The Silver Moon bloodline was known for many things: healing abilities, prophetic visions, a connection to the lunar cycles that went beyond what other shifters experienced. But their gifts manifested differently in each generation. We will not know the full extent of what the oath awakened until time reveals it. Evelyn turned from the mirror. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, you have more pressing concerns." Helena's expression grew serious. "Word of your bonding has spread through the fortress. The council is demanding an audience with Magnus, and there are reports from our scouts in the northern territories that require immediate attention." "What kind of reports?" "Troop movements." Helena lowered her voice. "Alpha Draven is positioning his forces along the border, not an invasion force, not yet, but far more warriors than any peaceful purpose would require." The news settled into Evelyn's stomach like a stone. She thought of Fenris, of his correspondence with Draven's court, of the conspiracy that had been building in the shadows while she focused on Asher's care. "Does Magnus know?" "He is in the War Council chamber now." Helena moved toward the door. "He sent me to fetch you. As his bonded partner, you have the right to attend." Evelyn took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Then let us not keep them waiting." The War Council chamber was a stark space, built for function rather than beauty. A massive table dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with maps and markers representing the disposition of forces throughout the territory. Magnus stood at the head of the table, his expression grave, surrounded by his senior commanders and the remaining loyal members of the council. Every eye turned to Evelyn as she entered. She felt the weight of their scrutiny like a physical pressure. Some gazes held curiosity, others suspicion, still others a grudging respect. But none held the open hostility she had faced in her first weeks at the fortress. The silver in her eyes, the mark of the sword oath, had changed the calculus of her position here. "Lady Ironwood," Magnus's voice carried clearly across the chamber. He used her new title deliberately, establishing her status before any could challenge it. "Thank you for joining us." Evelyn moved to stand at his right hand, the position of a bonded partner. "What is the situation?" Magnus gestured to the map. "Draven has moved 3 companies of warriors to within a day's march of our northern border. His stated purpose is winter training exercises, but our scouts report supply trains consistent with an extended campaign." "How extended?" "At least a month." Captain Theron spoke from across the table. "Perhaps longer. They have established forward camps with defensive fortifications. This is not a training exercise. It is a staging ground." Evelyn studied the map, her mind automatically cataloging terrain, distances, potential choke points. The strategic knowledge she had absorbed during the border wars rose to the surface unbidden. "The northern pass is the obvious route of attack," she said, "but it is also the most heavily defended. If I were Draven, I would use the pass as a feint while sending my main force through the eastern forest." Several commanders exchanged glances. The eastern forest was considered impassable for large troop movements, choked with undergrowth and treacherous terrain. "The forest would slow them considerably," one of the commanders observed. "It would." Evelyn agreed. "But it would also allow them to bypass our primary defenses entirely. During the border wars, I saw armies take routes that seemed impossible because the impossible routes were undefended." "She has a point," Captain Theron said reluctantly. "We have always assumed the forest would protect our eastern flank. If Draven has found a path through it, we could be caught between 2 forces." Magnus studied the map with renewed intensity. "We will need to send scouts into the forest, find any paths that might support troop movement. I can have teams ready within the hour." Theron confirmed. The council continued for another 2 hours, debating strategies, allocating resources, preparing for a conflict that might be days or weeks away. Throughout it all, Evelyn found herself drawn into discussions she would never have been permitted to join before the Sword Oath. Her experience from the border wars, once a liability that marked her as an outsider, had become an asset that the commanders could not afford to ignore. When the meeting finally concluded, Magnus drew her aside. "You impressed them," he said quietly. "Theron in particular. He is not easily swayed." "I simply shared what I knew," Evelyn replied. "Whether they choose to act on it is their decision." Magnus studied her face, something unreadable in his amber eyes. "You continue to surprise me, Evelyn Ashford. Every time I think I understand you, you reveal new depths. Is that a complaint?" "Far from it." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "It is perhaps the highest compliment I know how to give." Before she could respond, a messenger burst through the chamber doors, his face pale with urgency. "Alpha!" The young wolf gasped. "Lord Fenris has called an emergency gathering of his supporters. They are assembling in the Western Hall." Magnus's expression hardened. "How many?" "At least 50, perhaps more arriving." The number was significant. Not enough to challenge Magnus directly, but enough to cause serious disruption if they chose to act against him. "He is making his move," Evelyn said softly. "The news about Draven must have forced his hand. Or he believes Draven and his forces are close enough to support him if things go badly," Magnus replied. "Either way, we cannot allow this gathering to proceed unchallenged. What will you do?" "What any alpha must do when faced with open defiance." Magnus's voice was cold. "Remind them why I hold this position." He strode toward the doors, and Evelyn followed without hesitation. The Western Hall was packed with wolves, their tension filling the space like smoke before a fire. Fenris stood at the far end of the chamber, elevated on a small platform that allowed him to address the crowd. His face bore an expression of righteous indignation, the mask of a man who believed himself wronged. "My brothers and sisters," his voice carried clearly across the hall, "we have gathered today because our pack faces a crisis. An alpha who has abandoned our traditions, who has elevated a human to a position of power over true wolves, who has chosen a crippled heir over the strength our bloodline demands." The crowd murmured, some in agreement, others in uncertainty. Fenris continued, his voice rising with practiced passion. "The Sword Oath was meant for warriors, for wolves of proven bloodline and demonstrated valor, not for outsiders who arrive in our midst and bewitch our leader with soft words and softer touches." The doors of the hall crashed open. Magnus entered like a storm front, power radiating from him in waves that made the assembled wolves instinctively shrink back. Evelyn walked at his side, her silver-flecked eyes steady, her posture betraying no fear despite the hostile gazes fixed upon her. "You speak of tradition, Fenris." Magnus's voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade. "Let us discuss tradition." He advanced through the gathering, wolves parting before him like water before a ship's prow. "Tradition holds that an alpha's word is law within his territory. Tradition holds that challenges to that authority are settled through combat, not through whispered conspiracies and secret gatherings." Magnus reached the platform where Fenris stood, climbing the steps until they faced each other barely an arm's length apart. "Tradition also holds that correspondence with enemy alphas during times of tension is treason." Magnus's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but every ear in the hall caught each word. "Did you think I did not know about your letters to Draven? Did you think your meetings with his envoys went unobserved?" Fenris's composure cracked just for an instant. "You have no proof." "I have the testimony of 3 wolves who carried those letters," Magnus replied. "Wolves who valued their lives more than their loyalty to you when faced with the choice." The crowd's mood shifted palpably. Whispered conversations with an enemy alpha were one thing. Documented treason was something else entirely. "This is a desperate fabrication." Fenris attempted to rally, turning to address his supporters. "The alpha seeks to distract from his own failures by attacking those who dare to speak truth. Then let us settle this in the traditional way." Magnus stepped back, creating space between them. "I challenge you, Fenris Ironwood, to single combat. Here, now. Let the moon goddess judge between us." Silence fell across the hall, absolute and crushing. A formal challenge could not be refused without admitting cowardice. But accepting meant facing Magnus in combat, something Fenris had carefully avoided for the entirety of his nephew's reign. He was a schemer, a manipulator, a player of political games. He was not a warrior. "I will not dignify this farce with a response." Fenris's voice had lost its confident ring. "The Alpha is clearly unbalanced. I call upon the Council to intervene." "The Council has already reviewed the evidence." Elder Corvinus stepped forward from where he had been observing near the wall. His ancient face was grave. "Lord Fenris, you stand accused of treason against the Pack. The evidence is substantial. You may defend yourself through combat, or you may submit to judgment. Those are your only options." Fenris looked around the hall, searching for allies, for support, for any avenue of escape. He found only closed faces and averted eyes. His supporters had come expecting to witness a political coup, not a formal accusation of treason with documented proof. "You cannot do this." His voice had risen to something approaching a snarl. "I was regent of this pack. I held power here for 12 years while this boy learned to walk. I am owed respect." "You are owed nothing," Magnus replied, "except the justice our laws demand." For a long moment, Fenris stood frozen, his options exhausted, his schemes collapsed around him. Then something changed in his expression. The mask fell away entirely, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "If I am to fall," he said quietly, "I will not fall alone." He moved faster than Evelyn would have believed possible, his body blurring with partial shift as he launched himself not at Magnus, but at her. She had perhaps half the second to react. Her hand found the dagger at her belt, the weapon Magnus had given her so many weeks ago, and brought it up in a desperate defensive arc. Fenris's claws raked across her forearm, drawing blood, but her blade found his shoulder, driving deep into muscle and forcing him to twist away from the killing strike he had intended. Magnus roared, a sound of pure rage that shook the stones of the hall, and threw himself at his uncle. What followed was brutal and brief. Fenris was skilled, but Magnus was stronger, faster, driven by fury at the attack on his bonded partner. Within moments, Fenris was on his knees, Magnus's hand around his throat, claws extended to within an inch of tearing out his windpipe. "Yield," Magnus commanded, "or die." Fenris's eyes found Evelyn's across the hall. Even now, with death seconds away, there was no regret in his gaze, only hatred, pure and absolute. "I yield nothing," he spat, "and when Draven's forces arrive, you will all burn." Magnus's claws tightened, and Lord Fenris Ironwood died on the floor of his own gathering, his life's blood spreading across stones that had witnessed countless such endings throughout the centuries. In the silence that followed, Magnus rose to his feet. His hands were red with his uncle's blood. His face was a mask of cold authority. "Let this serve as a reminder." His voice carried to every corner of the hall. "I am the Alpha of this pack. My word is law, my justice is absolute, and any who threaten what is mine will meet the same fate." He turned and walked toward Evelyn, his expression softening slightly as he reached her side. "Your arm." "It is nothing." Evelyn examined the claw marks, already assessing the damage with professional detachment. "Shallow cuts. They will heal. Helena will tend to you. I can tend to myself." She met his eyes steadily. "We have more pressing concerns than scratches." Magnus held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Something passed between them in that look, something that went beyond words, an acknowledgement of what they had just faced together, a recognition that the battle was far from over. "He is right about one thing," Evelyn said quietly. "Draven's forces are coming. We need to prepare." "Then let us prepare." They walked out of the Western Hall together, leaving behind the body of a traitor and the shattered remnants of his conspiracy. The War Council would need to be reconvened, defenses would need to be strengthened, plans would need to be made. But first, there was a child who needed to know that his parents were safe. Asher was awake when they reached the royal chambers, his amber eyes bright with an awareness that seemed to increase daily. Helena had been watching over him during the confrontation, and her relief at their return was visible in the slight relaxation of her shoulders. "It is done?" she asked. "It is done." Magnus moved to the cradle, looking down at his son with an expression that mixed exhaustion with tenderness. "Fenris will threaten no one ever again." "And the others, his supporters?" "Scattered," Evelyn answered. "Those who remain will need to be watched, but without Fenris to organize them, they pose little immediate threat." "The immediate threat concerns me less than what approaches from the north." Helena's voice was grim. "More reports came while you were occupied. Draven's forces have broken camp. They are on the march." The news was not unexpected, but it still landed like a blow. Fenris's death would have been reported to Draven almost immediately. Whatever timetable the enemy Alpha had been working with, he would now be forced to accelerate. How long until they reach our borders? 2 days at most, perhaps less if they push hard. Magnus straightened, the mantle of Alpha settling visibly onto his shoulders. Summon the War Council. All of them, including those we suspected of sympathy with Fenris. It is time to see where true loyalties lie. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of preparation and controlled chaos. The Ironwood Pack had not faced a direct military threat in nearly a decade, and the machinery of war required time to set in motion. Warriors were recalled from outlying posts. Weapons were distributed from armories that had gathered dust during the years of peace. Defensive positions were established along the likely routes of approach. Evelyn found herself at the center of the medical preparations, her experience from the border wars proving invaluable once again. She organized supplies, established triage protocols, trained volunteers in basic wound care. The skills she had hoped to leave behind in her previous life had followed her here, as insistent as shadows. On the morning of the second day, she stood on the fortress walls and watched the northern horizon darken with approaching forces. Draven had not bothered with subtlety. His army marched in full view, banners flying, drums pounding a rhythm that carried for miles across the winter landscape. It was a display of strength, intended to intimidate, to demoralize, to convince the defenders that resistance was futile. Magnus stood beside her, his expression unreadable. "More than we anticipated," he said quietly. "He must have stripped his territory bare to assemble this force, which means he cannot sustain a long campaign," Evelyn observed. "If we can hold for a week, perhaps 2, his supply lines will fail. That assumes we can hold it all. The fortress is strong, our warriors are motivated, and they are fighting for their homes, their families, their way of life. That counts for something." Magnus turned to look at her, something like wonder in his amber eyes. "You truly believe we can win?" "I believe we have no choice but to try." Evelyn met his gaze steadily. "I did not survive the border wars by assuming the worst outcome was inevitable. I survived by fighting for every inch of ground, every moment of time, every life that could be saved." Below them, Draven's army began to deploy, spreading across the valley like a dark tide. The sound of their movement, the clash of weapons and armor, the howling of wolves eager for battle, filled the air with the promise of violence to come. "Whatever happens," Magnus said, "whatever the outcome of this day, I want you to know that I do not regret the sword oath, that binding myself to you was the wisest decision I have made since taking the crown." Evelyn felt warmth spread through her chest despite the bitter cold of the winter morning. "Ask me again when this battle is over," she replied. "I may have different thoughts once I have seen how you fight." A bark of surprised laughter escaped Magnus, brief but genuine, the first laugh she had heard from him since Fenris's death. "Then I shall endeavor to impress you." The first assault came at midday. Draven's forces struck at the main gate, a probing attack designed to test the defenders rather than break through. Magnus had anticipated this, positioning his strongest warriors to meet the initial wave while holding reserves for the true assault that would follow. Evelyn remained in the medical station she had established in the Great Hall, far from the fighting but connected to it through the constant flow of wounded being carried back from the walls. She worked without rest, cleaning wounds, setting bones, making the terrible decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. It was familiar work. Too familiar. The faces changed, wolf replacing human, but the wounds were the same. The blood was the same. The desperate will to survive was the same. As the afternoon wore on, the attacks intensified. Draven had realized that the defenders would not break easily, and he committed more forces to each successive wave. The walls held, but barely. Each assault claimed defenders who could not be replaced, while Draven's reserves seemed endless. By nightfall, the situation had grown critical. "He will try to breach the eastern wall before dawn," Captain Theron reported, his face streaked with blood and soot. "Our defenses there are weakest, and he knows it. Can we reinforce?" "Not without leaving the main gate vulnerable." Magnus studied the tactical map, searching for options that did not exist. "He has us trapped between 2 threats. If we concentrate our forces, he exploits the weakness we create." Evelyn looked at the map with fresh eyes, seeing not just positions and numbers, but the story they told. Draven was methodical, patient, willing to sacrifice warriors to achieve his objectives. He was fighting to win, yes, but he was also fighting to minimize his own losses, which meant he was thinking about what came after. "He intends to rule here," she said slowly. "After he defeats us, he is not trying to destroy the pack, he is trying to subjugate it." Magnus looked at her sharply. "Go on." "If he wanted simply to kill us, he would throw everything at a single point and accept the casualties. Instead, he is probing, testing, looking for the path of least resistance. He wants to win with as much of his force intact as possible, because he will need that force to control the territory afterward. Which means he will not risk his own life until he is certain of victory." Evelyn pointed to a position on the map where the enemy command structure had been observed. "He stays back, directing from safety. If we could threaten him directly, force him to choose between his own survival and his tactical plan, we would need to get a force through his lines without being detected," Theron said skeptically. "Impossible with the numbers he has deployed." "Not impossible." Magnus's voice had taken on a considering tone. "Difficult, dangerous, but not impossible." He looked at Evelyn. "The forest path you mentioned, the one through the eastern woods. Could a small force use it to circle behind Draven's position?" "Possibly." Evelyn felt her heart begin to race as she understood what he was suggesting. "But it would have to be very small, 12 warriors at most, and they would need to move quickly before Draven realizes what is happening. I will lead them." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. An alpha leaving his fortress during a siege, risking himself in a desperate gambit. It violated every principle of defensive warfare. It was also their best chance of survival. "The Council will never approve," Theron said. "The Council will not know until it is done," Magnus replied. He turned to Evelyn. "You will command the defense in my absence." She wanted to protest, wanted to argue that the risk was too great, that there had to be another way. But she looked at the map, looked at the dwindling numbers of their defenders, looked at the enemy forces arrayed against them, and knew that he was right. "Come back to me," she said instead. "That is an order. I thought we were partners. Is not ordering me around. Consider it a strong suggestion." Magnus smiled, brief and fierce, and then he was gone, gathering the warriors who would accompany him on his desperate mission. Evelyn watched him go, memorizing the set of his shoulders, the way he moved, the absolute certainty that radiated from him even now. Then she turned to Theron and the remaining commanders. "You heard the Alpha," she said, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her gut. "We hold until he returns, whatever it takes." The night that followed was the longest of Evelyn's life. She divided her time between the medical station and the walls, watching for any sign of the small force that had slipped away in the darkness. The fighting continued in waves, Draven probing their defenses, testing for weaknesses, wearing down the defenders through sheer attrition. Twice, the eastern wall nearly fell. Twice, Evelyn found herself on the battlements, directing reserves to plug gaps in the line, her dagger in hand, though she knew it would do little good against fully shifted wolves. The silver in her eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, a beacon that the warriors rallied around. She did not know when she had stopped being an outsider and become something else. She only knew that these wolves were looking to her for leadership, and she would not fail them. The third assault came just before dawn, and it was different from those that had come before. Draven had grown impatient. The probing attacks had revealed no easy weakness, and his scouts had reported that Magnus and a small force had slipped away during the night. The enemy Alpha understood that time was no longer on his side. Whatever gambit Magnus was attempting, Draven needed to end this siege before it could succeed. He committed everything. The wave of attackers that crashed against the walls was unlike anything the defenders had faced. Hundreds of wolves in full shift, supported by warriors in hybrid form carrying siege ladders and battering rams. The sound of their assault was deafening, a cacophony of howls and screams and the terrible crash of bodies against stone. The eastern wall fell first. Evelyn heard the shouts of alarm from her position in the great hall, heard the thunder of enemy forces pouring through the breach. She grabbed her medical bag and ran toward the sound of fighting, knowing that the wounded would need her, knowing also that there might not be a fortress left to defend if the breach could not be contained. What she found was chaos. The eastern courtyard had become a killing ground, defenders and attackers locked in desperate combat, blood staining the snow in expanding pools of crimson. Theron was there, rallying what remained of the garrison, but his forces were outnumbered and exhausted. "Fall back to the inner keep," the captain ordered, his voice barely audible above the din of battle. "Protect the Alpha's heir." The inner keep, where Asher waited with Helena. Evelyn did not hesitate. She turned and ran, dodging between fighting wolves, her silver-flecked eyes fixed on the doors that led to the central tower. She had to reach Asher, had to ensure his safety. Nothing else mattered. She burst through those doors to find Helena standing over Asher's cradle, a ceremonial blade in her aged hands, her violet eyes fierce with protective fury. 3 enemy wolves had somehow gotten past the outer defenses and now circled the healer, their teeth bared, their intentions clear. "Get away from him!" Evelyn's voice came out as something close to a growl. The wolves turned to face this new threat, and for a moment, surprise flickered across their inhuman faces. A human woman, unarmed except for a small blade, standing against 3 full-grown shifters. Then Evelyn moved. The training she had absorbed during the border wars took over. She did not try to match the wolves in strength or speed. Instead, she used the environment, grabbing a torch from the wall and sweeping it in a wide arc that forced the nearest attacker to leap backward. Fire, she had learned, was one of the few things that gave even confident wolves pause. Helena struck at the same moment, her ceremonial blade finding the flank of a wolf that had turned toward Evelyn. The cut was shallow, but it drew attention, splitting the attackers between 2 threats. It should not have been enough. 2 women, 1 old and 1 human, against 3 trained warriors. By any rational calculation, they should have been overwhelmed in seconds. But Asher changed the calculation. The infant had been silent throughout the confrontation, his amber eyes tracking the danger with an awareness no child his age should possess. As the largest wolf lunged toward his cradle, something happened that would be spoken of for generations to come. Asher opened his mouth and howled. It was not the cry of an infant. It was something else entirely. A sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that resonated through stone and bone alike, that carried within it an authority beyond words. The attacking wolves froze mid-motion, their bodies locking in place as though seized by invisible hands. Their eyes widened with shock and terror as they found themselves unable to move, unable even to breathe without permission from the power that now held them. The howl continued, rising in pitch and intensity, and Evelyn felt it reach out beyond the walls of the chamber, beyond the tower, beyond the fortress itself. It called to something ancient and primal in every wolf who heard it, demanding attention, demanding obedience, demanding recognition. In the courtyard below, the enemy wolves fell to their knees. In the breach they had fought so hard to create, Draven's warriors stopped fighting and began to tremble. Across the entire battlefield, every shifter who heard that sound understood with absolute certainty that they were in the presence of something sacred. "The king's call," Helena whispered, her voice filled with awe. "The gift of the first alpha. I never thought to witness it in my lifetime." Asher fell silent, exhausted by whatever power he had summoned. The frozen wolves collapsed, unconscious but alive, their bodies unable to process what had been demanded of them. And in that moment of silence, Evelyn heard something else, the sounds of combat from beyond the walls, growing closer. The howls of ironwood wolves on the attack, the unmistakable voice of Magnus, roaring commands as he led his force against the rear of Draven's army. The gambit had worked, but it was Asher who had given them the time they needed. "What happened here?" Magnus demanded when he finally reached the central tower, bloody and exhausted, but very much alive. "We heard the call from half a mile away. I thought—" He stopped when he saw his son, sleeping peacefully in his cradle, as though nothing unusual had occurred. Then he looked at Evelyn, at Helena, at the unconscious enemy wolves scattered across the floor. "Your son happened," Evelyn replied. She moved to his side, suddenly aware of how desperately she had needed to see him alive. "He has the king's call, Magnus, the gift that legends speak of." Magnus stared at his sleeping child, wonder and disbelief warring on his face. "The king's call has not manifested in our bloodline for 10 generations, he said slowly. "It was thought to be lost forever." "Apparently not." Helena's voice carried a note of dry humor despite her exhaustion. "Your broken heir just ended a battle that might have destroyed us. I suspect the council will have difficulty arguing his unworthiness now." Dawn approached slowly, gray light creeping across a landscape scarred by battle. The snow that had been pristine white 2 days ago was now churned to bloody mud, littered with the bodies of fallen warriors from both sides. The fortress still stood, battered but unbroken, its defenders exhausted but still fighting. And then, from behind Draven's lines, came the sounds of chaos. Howls of alarm, shouts of confusion, the unmistakable clash of close combat where no combat should be happening. The enemy forces that had been preparing for another assault on the walls suddenly found themselves fighting in two directions, their carefully maintained formations dissolving into confusion. He did it, Theron breathed. The mad bastard actually did it. On the walls, the defenders rallied. Energy they had thought exhausted surged back into tired limbs. A cheer rose from 100 throats as they watched their enemies fall into disarray. "Now," Evelyn commanded. "While they are confused, hit them now." The gates opened, and the ironwood wolves poured out to meet their enemies on open ground. What followed was a battle worthy of the songs that would later be sung about it. The defenders struck like a hammer against an anvil, crushing Draven's disorganized forces between the sally from the fortress and Magnus's attack from the rear. Evelyn did not join the fighting. Her place was in the medical station, preparing for the flood of wounded that would soon arrive. But she watched from the walls as the tide of battle turned, as Draven's army began to crumble, as the enemy Alpha himself was forced to flee or face capture. It was not a complete victory. Draven escaped with a portion of his forces, retreating northward through the same forest path that Magnus had used against him. But his invasion had been shattered, his ambitions checked, his reputation as an unbeatable military leader destroyed. When Magnus finally returned through the gates, bloody and exhausted but triumphant, Evelyn was waiting for him. "You came back," she said. "You ordered me to," he replied, "and I have learned not to ignore your orders." Strong suggestions. Those two. They stood there in the courtyard, surrounded by cheering warriors in the aftermath of battle, and Evelyn felt something shift between them, some final barrier falling, some last reservation crumbling. She reached up and pulled his head down to hers, kissing him in full view of the assembled pack. The cheers that followed were deafening. The months following the winter defense passed in a blur of recovery and rebuilding. Summer came and went, bringing warmth to heal the scars the battle had left on both land and people. Autumn painted the forests in gold and crimson, a reminder that life continued despite the violence that had threatened to end it. And now, with winter approaching once more, the Ironwood Pack gathered to celebrate not just their survival, but the transformation that had made survival possible. In the Great Hall of Ironwood Fortress, 9 months after the battle that would be remembered for generations, a celebration was underway. Asher Ironwood sat in a specially designed chair that allowed him to be part of the festivities, despite his limited mobility. At 15 months old, he had grown into a bright-eyed child whose amber gaze missed nothing, whose silver-white hair marked him as something unique among the wolves of his generation. His legs would never work as others did, but his mind was sharp, his spirit unbroken, and his smile had the power to light up any room he entered. Evelyn stood nearby, watching her bonded partner's son with the fierce pride of a mother. The title was not yet official, but everyone in the pack had come to recognize the truth of it. She had fought for this child, killed for this child, reshaped her entire life around ensuring his survival and happiness. In return, he had given her something she had never expected to find: a family, a purpose, a home. Magnus appeared at her side, pressing a cup of warm wine into her hands. "You are thinking too hard," he observed. "This is supposed to be a celebration." "I am celebrating." Evelyn took a sip of the wine, feeling its warmth spread through her. "I am also remembering. A year ago, I was a lonely nurse in a human settlement, gathering herbs in the snow. Now I am Lady Ironwood, partner to an alpha, mother to an heir. Regrets? None." She leaned against his shoulder, a casual intimacy that had become natural between them. Only wonder at how much can change in so short a time. The hall was full of wolves who had once regarded her with suspicion or hostility. Now they nodded respectfully when she passed, sought her counsel on matters of health and medicine, acknowledged her authority as Magnus's partner in leadership. The sword oath had made her position official, but it was her actions during the crisis that had earned their genuine acceptance. Elder Corvinus approached them, moving slowly but steadily despite his advanced age. The old counselor had become an unexpected ally in the months since the battle, supporting the reforms that Magnus and Evelyn had proposed. "Alpha, Lady Ironwood." He inclined his head to each of them. "The council has reviewed your proposal regarding the ancient laws on physical imperfection, and the vote was unanimous. Corvinus's weathered face creased into something approaching a smile. From this day forward, no child of the Ironwood Pack will be judged unworthy based on physical condition alone. The old ways have served us for centuries, but it is time to acknowledge that strength comes in many forms. Evelyn felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away, unwilling to show weakness even in this moment of triumph. "Thank you," she managed. "This means more than I can say." "It is we who should thank you, Lady Ironwood," Corvinus replied. "You have shown us possibilities we were too blind to see. Your son—" He glanced at Asher, who was being entertained by a young wolf pup that had wandered too close to his chair. "Your son will be a remarkable alpha someday. Different from any who came before, but no less worthy for that difference." He bowed again and moved away, leaving Magnus and Evelyn alone in their corner of the celebration. "Our son," Magnus said quietly. He used the words deliberately, acknowledging what had become true in every way that mattered. "Our son," Evelyn agreed. They watched Asher laugh as the pup licked his face, his small hands grabbing ineffectually at fur, his joy simple and pure and untouched by the complexities that surrounded him. Outside the fortress walls, autumn was giving way to winter once more. The snow that would soon blanket the territory carried no threat this year, only the promise of quiet months ahead. The world was at peace, at least for now, allowing wounds both physical and political to continue their healing. But within the walls, something new had taken root. A family forged from unlikely beginnings. A pack transformed by the courage of outsiders. A future that had seemed impossible now stretching out before them, full of challenges certainly, but also full of hope. Evelyn thought of her grandmother, of the silver pendant that now hung in a place of honor in their chambers, of the legacy she had inherited without knowing. "You carry healing in your hands. Your gentleness is not weakness." She had carried those words through war and peace, through loss and discovery, through transformation beyond anything she could have imagined. Now, watching her family in the fire-lit hall, surrounded by wolves who had become her pack, she finally understood what her grandmother had truly meant. Strength was not the absence of vulnerability. It was the courage to remain gentle in a world that demanded hardness. It was the willingness to fight for what mattered, even when the odds seemed impossible. It was the determination to build something worth protecting, and then to protect it with everything you had. Magnus's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing with the easy familiarity of a bond that had deepened beyond anything either of them had expected. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am exactly where I am supposed to be," Evelyn replied. "For the first time in my life, I am exactly where I belong." The celebration continued around them, laughter and music and the sounds of a pack at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new struggles to face. The reforms they had begun would take years to fully implement. Enemies beyond their borders would always pose threats. The work of leadership was never truly finished. But tonight, there was joy. There was family. There was the knowledge that they had built something that would outlast them, a legacy of change that would shape generations to come. Asher let out a squeal of delight as the pup finally escaped his grasp, and both Magnus and Evelyn laughed at the indignant expression on their son's face. "He will be trouble when he grows older," Magnus observed. "I can see it already." "Good," Evelyn smiled. "The world needs more troublemakers, the kind who refuse to accept that things cannot change." She leaned up to kiss his cheek, then moved toward Asher, scooping him up in her arms despite the protests of his flailing limbs. The child settled against her chest, his amber eyes finding her face, his small hand reaching up to touch the silver flecks that had appeared in her gaze the night of the sword oath. "Mine," he said, one of the few words he had learned to speak. "Mine." "Yes," Evelyn whispered, pressing her lips to his silver-white hair. "Yours, and you are mine, always." The fire crackled, the music played, the pack celebrated, and somewhere in the night sky, the moon rose full and bright, blessing all who stood beneath its light with the promise of things to come. The oath had been fulfilled, the story had found its ending. But as all who have lived long enough eventually learn, endings are really just beginnings in disguise. Somewhere in the future that stretched before them, new challenges waited, new adventures called, new chapters of the story of Ironwood Pack remained to be written. But those are tales for another time. For now, there was peace. There was love. There was a family that had found each other against all odds and would face whatever came next together. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.